Today we are speaking with Andre Vlok, a conflict resolution expert extraordinaire. Andre had a successful and long legal career as a commercial litigation attorney, and then started 3 specialist consultancies in the areas of mediation and conflict resolution, dealing with workplace disputes, commercial negotiation, and all sorts of other things. He also does coaching and training in these fields, and offers various forms of distance learning and hybrid courses for senior management, and has written 2 books whose titles I absolutely love, but we're going to talk about them later: Dangerous Magic and Hamlet's Mirror. So Andre, I've been following you on Twitter since it actually was Twitter, sort of at its peak. And I was often stopped in my tracks by your posts because I found your observations on conflict really insightful and often profound. And obviously you comment on a lot of live conflict issues like taxi strikes and war. And of course you post your walks on your farm with your dogs and your pig. So I'm delighted to have you here and just wanting to talk to you about conflict, culture, the concept of dangerous magic. And then, as I mentioned to you when we spoke earlier, in preparation for this, to touch on the areas of conflict we see in that area of agency and marketer, but obviously just broadly, I'm just really interested to hear your perspectives on things in this area. So just to kick off, how did you segue from your legal career into conflict resolution? Was it something that you did in the course of your legal practice, or was it something that you went into afterwards?
Gillian, you get me in trouble with your very first question. I get into trouble for this because I have to answer it honestly, and I've done so in writing at a few places, and I do get into a bit of trouble.
Okay.
I was your conventional litigator. Court work. I had one hammer and everything was a nail. If you didn't see things my way, I'd sue you. So I got paid for that, and I was successful in that. And due to quite a few things coming together, I started doubting that. Is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? Is this really, am I adding anything to conflict? What is it that I'm bringing to those fields? And then I made, some would say, the mistake of dipping into what options are there, and I saw how, especially South Africans, with respect, how bad we are at conflict, how limited we are in the menu of options we see and regard as being available to us. I say that we sulk or fight or litigate. Those are how we see things, and as I started delving into that, my legal career just started looking so cold and so two-dimensional, and that's why I thought, okay, let's give this a try and do it properly, and because of that, I eventually stuck around for a few years, growing increasingly more and more unhappy with traditional litigation, until I thought, okay, I need to do this properly, and the break had to come, and it's about 7 years now that I've so in a sense it was a natural progression, using some of the tools and so on, but effectively, conceptually, it was a complete break with what I was doing for the part of my life.
And I mean, it's really, it's a very interesting point that I remember watching one of what's that guy, Leon Schuster. I remember watching one of his movies and just being sort of so struck by how quick to anger we are, and of course it all unwinds, and then it's hilarious when you find out that it was him. But actually, I didn't find it that funny. I was quite horrified, just how really trigger happy we are to veer to like extreme anger. So it must be really interesting. So when people come to you, and obviously they probably, your briefs are probably quite complex by the time they come to you. What's the first thing you do when you sit down with a new brief, whether it's individual or workplace or whatever?
The biggest part of that is, of course, to assess what is going on. You can't get, and to get back to your original point of that trigger happiness, we often jump to conclusions in our conflicts. There's an understandable rush, especially in business. We don't have time, we don't have money, this thing must be finished, I can't sit around, I don't have time for this, it must be done by 10 o'clock. And we rush to resolution. And that's understandable, but it's fatal in my, and if we want to do it right, if we want to stop this thing from becoming a cyclical conflict and it's back again next week, then we need to assess it properly. Now, if we're dealing with taxi wars, if we're dealing with urban conflict, then we do a proper conflict map. We look at all the players, we look at all the causes, the symptoms, absolutely every little nuance, and we start implementing from there. If it's a personal conflict, we do that, but in a smaller scale. What is the conflict? How does it materialize? What are the symptoms? What are the conflict causes? We see it in social media. We see it in standard media. Our leaders, our political leaders, we keep on dealing with conflicts. We're like a terrible doctor that keeps on dealing with a cough. No one ever asks, no one understands, no one deals with why do we cough. And in that first stage, that assessment, that understanding why this conflict is manifesting, what are the symptoms, what happens if we don't get it right, all of that is crucial. Before we start with who did what, before we get to resolution or management, there is different shades. Do we manage it? Do we resolve it? Or do we transform it? And all of that you can't move before you've got that in place.
And do you find, do you do that map? Do you try and sort of interpret it with the information you have to hand, or do you do it with them? Because I wonder whether people actually don't know how to articulate those things.
Generally, we don't understand conflict, even people in the field. You often see that with attorneys, with people, with law enforcement, with social security. You simply don't have that knowledge. So it's part of my job to guide you through that. And it doesn't come across as a lecture. I'll simply ask you questions and I'll get the information that I need in that way.
Yeah, and you have this sort of independence, so you don't have the emotional connection to the conflict, obviously, which must help you. I just as an aside, I read an article this morning about how New Zealand is tackling crime, which I thought, well, that's interesting. Who even knew they had any? But they've got Maori sort of, I think they call them negotiators, who actually try and diffuse conflict before it gets to the police. And actually a lot of them are women, so but a lot of it is fighting and carrying on, and the women say to them, do you want to spend the night in jail, or do you actually rather want to go home and have a nice meal? And they're able to talk to them in their own kind of cultural nuance. And I thought that's quite interesting to have this kind of in between before it gets to the police, because as you say, I mean, sometimes they just make things worse.
Those New Zealand examples, I'm researching some of that for my new book, and they have quite an unusually high degree of success with that. And I think one of the things they get right, which most of our political leaders and law enforcement leaders don't get right, is the fine balance between compromise, an unhealthy compromise where for the sake of peace I'd keep quiet, but that resentment stays there, so next week we're back here where we are, and now it's worse. And just that where you convince, where you persuade someone to act in their own best interest. Conflict management has moved on a lot from convincing people in meme style language how to live a proper life, how to be a good person. I don't know always if it's a case of us having given up on that, or whether we simply understand that it's not necessary. I don't have to persuade you, and that's what those negotiators are so good at. I don't have to persuade you to love your family. I don't have to tell you how to be a good person. That takes time and who listens. What I do need to do is to persuade you how to act in your best interest. Do you want to spend the night in jail? Aren't you happier if your family is a good, healthy family? So those triggers, and I think it also touches on something that in South Africa we are going to be forced to start looking at, and that is to do away with compromise. Compromise is, there's this wonderful definition that I like. Compromise means giving away something that I would have preferred to keep, and our politicians do it. We see it in our municipalities where coalitions are, because we don't understand conflict. We stick plasters on gunshot wounds. We just try and keep the peace. We try and get the next vote done, and we're going to see it in spades before our elections.
Yes, yeah.
Where compromise to keep people quiet, compromise to get the vote, compromise to shut the loud voices down, is seen as a conflict strategy, and it's not. It creates these cyclical conflicts. It causes resentment. It causes distrust. Because you and I have been trying this 10 times, and because we're not making progress, I start disliking you. I don't trust your promises. I don't have any confidence in the two of us being able to resolve this. And that's what we see for a wonderful example is our coalition politics. Yeah, in Quebec, do we have a better example than that? It's a cyclical thing. We compromise, and you know, that's not conflict management. That's not being successful. We see it in a lot of professional relationships. I think you would maybe deal with that now and then in advertising and marketing, in strategies as well. Where for the sake of retaining the client, for the sake of being polite, for the sake of being nice, for the sake of getting through the week or getting the invoice paid, we compromise with our important conflicts. And that is
such an important point.
That is simply not a strategy, a sustainable strategy. And we become co-creators of some of our own miseries because of our lack of skill in actually resolving conflict.
Yeah, I mean, so many people are they say, oh, I don't like conflict, but I mean, it's part of life. So, you know, what you say there about conflict, about compromise being, you know, you give away something you'd rather keep or rather have kept, and then that leads to resentment and, you know, it's not fixing the problem. I see it so often in this world of agencies and marketers where the behavior of the client, let's say, is absolutely unacceptable. It's unacceptable. It's abusive. It's short timelines. There's shouting. There's threats. It's just an awful thing. And often I'll speak to the managing director and I'll say, but you've got to sit down with your client and find a way. You can't. This is not a sustainable relationship. And they'll say, oh, we can't because we're already on the back foot.
Yeah.
So then
it's also understandable, you know.
It is, but I just, you know, it's not sustainable. As you say, that cyclical conflict, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, and then there's going to be no foot left because they're going to get fired. So, you know, it's just I think there's so much of that, and yeah, our politics and these coalition governments just don't seem to be able to work at all. And then
the irony and maybe the frustrating part to see is that this cyclical nature of our conflicts, the compromise strategy, it literally doesn't have to be that way. It takes a bit more knowledge, it takes a bit more patience, it takes a bit more skill, but there are alternatives to, you know, whether it's a coalition government or whether it's a difficult client. There are so many, and that's one of the things that attracted me to doing this for a living, is that there's literally a better way of resolving our conflicts. And we must also, as South Africans, we must get away from, I often have to explain this in boardrooms where conflict management, modern conflict management, has absolutely nothing to do with being nice, with being a doormat, or being politically correct, or being a good person. You can be those things, of course you can, but if you do conflict management in the boardroom, in the coalition government, as a leader of any type, if you do it correctly, it's about efficiency. It's bluntly put, it's about winning your conflicts.
Yes.
It's simply a question of what is that win. And that is why compromise is truly such a, if you once you start talking about it, once you start seeing it in practice, in your boardrooms and in your business, it is such a poor, it really is the box. We play with the box and we throw the gift away. Conflict is, especially in advertising and marketing. I get that my clients in those fields immediately understand it when we start talking about it. Conflict is an energy, not some new age energy. It's a real, true energy that you can use.
Yes,
and
yes, you can use positively. Yeah, absolutely.
If you're confident, if you're conflict competent, and you're conflict confident, you will see that as an opportunity, not to be avoided, not to be prevented, not to be put in a manageable box. You use that, the difficult client, the impossible deadline, the shrill and shouted expectation. You use those things to your benefit and theirs, not as compromise, but as a creative, a new solution, a new level of answer. If you, and I see that in across the spectrum of professions, the people who do that well, they really bring something new to their field.
And what do you need to be able to do that well? When you say conflict competent or conflict confident, or what do you need? Because there was one quote that I read about you. I think it was on one of your book websites on Amazon, and somebody had written about your straight talking and truth telling yet caring way. And I thought, to your point, you don't have to play Mr. Nice Guy, but you also don't have to be Mr. Nasty or Miss Nasty. So how do you find that balance between being honest and being not compromising and finding the right solution, but in a caring way?
It's obviously, using myself as an example, that's also generally my advice to people. It's a question of timing as well. Short term, a compromise may be a good idea, but in general, if we're talking about, if this was an elevator pitch, I tell you not to be nice. Don't be nice. Start building a reputation as a problem solver. I have a lot of clients and opponents who can't stand, who don't believe that I'm a nice guy at all. But they do know that when they sit down with me, the problem will probably get solved. And that in commercial terms, in the corporate world especially, but also on a much more personal level, that becomes a currency that is far more effective, far more easy to manage than this weird obsession we have. I'm not sure where we got it from, in being nice, and thinking naively. You walk into a boardroom and that is your strategy. You are going to hurt your client's best interest, your business best interest. Nice gets absolutely no cigars. You can be nice, but that mustn't be your strategy. And being this compromiser, this appeaser, it does not work for our politicians, as we can see. And that's where the sad part comes in. Now in the boardroom or in the political arena, we, especially as South Africans, you're already starting to see the change in Europe. But we see this binary position of either a bastard or I'm a nice guy. And both of those ends of the spectrums, it must end badly. That's not conflict management. You're simply being lazy or ignorant. if those are your options.
And not dealing with issues on the table at all.
The first part of your question there, and I deal with this in Dangerous Magic to quite an extent, is there is and I think this is maybe part of why we're not seeing more. The results are there, the studies are there, the tools are there, but we're not yet, and I highlight the yet, we're not yet seeing that really leaking into South African boardrooms. We're seeing it pretty much everywhere else except here. But that's fine. We'll get there. That's part of my mission. And that is to bring those tools to people. The tools exist, and they're measurable, manageable tools. But you are going to, especially mid to senior management, you are going to have to do a little bit of work. You are going to have to understand the nuances of identity conflicts and how that triggers people. You are going to have to understand that we should stop focusing on HR and productivity and deadlines and those things. They're important, but the symptoms. The golden thread that runs through every boardroom, through every business, is human conflict. Stop trying to understand and be an expert in 10 or 20 of these things. Once you see them and approach them as conflicts, and remember, conflict, when I say conflict, it's not a shouting match, it's not a fight. It's those things.
I think there's that reframing that's so important.
Conflict is a divorce, is a war in some other country. It is a fist fight outside a pub. But it's also, and we do ourselves a tremendous favor by expanding our thinking. As soon as you and I are in a situation where our interests are different, that is a conflict. You and I could be the best of mates, but we both applied for this position. You're in conflict. Working together, we're in conflict. Your client examples. The client wants everything done for $10 by 10 o'clock. It doesn't work that way. You're in conflict. Instead of avoiding that or defining it as something else, this is just business, it's just another day, see it as conflict, because that opens the door to a range of efficient tools that you can use. But the bad news is that as a manager, as a leader, you're going to have to do some work on yourself, on your team, on your business, for the basics. You can get someone like me into to help you with the bigger, really ugly things. But and it's a personal choice. To what extent do I want to understand conflict better? Because with that understanding comes the tools as well.
What do you think I know this is a difficult question, but if you had to say, what are the three basics, the first three things that if you had to say to somebody, right, you need to go and do some work, obviously read my book, but what are the basics they need to understand?
I love the question. It's strange. I've never thought of it that way. I would ask for an absolute change of mind on conflict itself. Make peace with it. It's with us. It is, stop avoiding it. Stop labeling it into all sorts of, trying to label it into non-existence. Deal with it. See it for as ugly as it is, as loud as it is, as harmful as it is. See it, make peace with it, and deal with it efficiently. Secondly, I would ask you to roll up your sleeves, become conflict competent, and whether you read a book, whether you get some coaching done, a lot of it is complex, but again, it's your personal investment. We do it with so many other fields. We all decide to some extent on a spectrum, how do we eat, how much do we exercise, how much do we read, how much do we read business management books. this is something you should spend some time with. And it's a life skill. It shouldn't be a Saturday little workshop once every 2 years. Work that into the very fiber of your life, where you read a bit on it, you think a bit, you reflect on it, and you bring it into your business, and you really make it part of your DNA. If you want to leave a really wonderful legacy, put that into your company's DNA. And then thirdly would be an absolutely technical issue, and that is, and if you read my work, you'll see why I say this. Identity conflicts. That's it.
Yes. So what is that? What does that mean?
The essence of nearly all conflicts, whether it's Gaza or retrenchments or teamwork or you and I arguing about getting divorced, it has to do with our interests, and our interests go back to our identities, who we are. And so much wonderful work has been done in the last few years that truly changes a host of disciplines, including conflict management. And the scary part is that a lot of the ways that we fight and argue and importantly persuade people in marketing, in advertising, the methods of the tried and tested methods of persuading people, leave aside conflict if you choose to, but persuasion has changed. We now know how to persuade people, and crucially, we see, and study after study, we see how certain of those tools are actually counterproductive. It's bad enough that I'm not managing to persuade you, but I'm actually entrenching you in your previous position, the very position that I'm trying to get you out of. That's why, to use global examples, that's why on social media or anywhere, you go and you see the arguments about vaccination, about Trump, about voting for the ANC. Now, the arguments, it could be study after study, it could be scientist after scientist, it could be 500 YouTube videos, and you're convinced. It looks so obvious. And yet, none of it works. You see 5,000 comments and this us and them dynamic that we see in identity conflicts. And those are big picture examples, but it's also true of the client that runs in there. That's their identity, that's their values, that's their and the way we try and convince them. To you, it's obvious. Your magazines, your research, your experience, your studying, your other clients all make this quite obviously true. This is the way it needs to be done. And we try and show them, and we use that as arguments. No, Gillian, everyone else does it this way. No, you can't do it this way because it's never been done that way. And we try and persuade them. And the studies show us, just like with vaccination, just like with COVID, just like with Trump, those things actually, I'm not persuading you. I'm making you double down on your view. And that is, even in that just purely commercial manifestation of conflict, it is in your best interest to know and understand these tools. It's not just something some conflict guy talks about. This is how I do in your business. The tools exist. You can be better at this tomorrow morning. Ask yourself, why is it that you don't do these things?
People just sort of blunder through, don't they? I mean, I think one of the things that I see a lot in these sort of relationships that I deal with is there's a lack of understanding of the person across the table. What's actually going on?
There's your identity conflict right there.
What's going on in their world. I mean, I've had lots of hilarious examples of it, but just absolute lack of understanding. But also there's a lack of understanding of the level of confidence that person has on the other side of the table, and then the language that is used to try and sell something actually makes them more nervous, and they retreat, as you say, rather than being convinced. They're not convinced. In fact, they're now terrified.
Remember, in that example, you are attacking that person's identity.
Yeah.
We're talking about rates, for example. We're talking about what the market wants. And you're an expert on that. But that's not how your client, for example, that's not how they experience that.
Yeah.
This is an attack. It makes their identity, their values feel as if it's threatened.
Yeah.
Right there, you trigger that defensiveness.
Yeah. I did a partnership alignment between an agency and a marketer. And it stuck with me because the words used were just so hard and deep. And so the agency was talking about feeling belittled and abused, and feeling sick on Sunday nights, knowing that they were going to have to go to work and deal with this.
The defensiveness and identity conflict mismanaged.
Yeah, and the client's language was that they felt unheard, and they felt that every meeting was a battleground. They literally felt that they were going into battle. And then you've got these two people on the other side that just trying to convince people to buy something. It's a very strange environment, but as you say, on both of those sides, neither of them is understanding the other one, or trying to,
and making it worse.
Yeah.
And both of those sides would have gone away, and as long as it lasts, as long as they want to convince, they would have gone away and picked up the wrong tools to convince. They stay patient. They go and do more research. They speak more politely. They bring someone else in from the outside, and all of that is wrong because you see it as a marketing issue, while it should be seen as a conflict issue.
Yeah.
And once
what would your advice be to someone in that instance? What would you suggest that they do to try and break that, or solve it?
Obviously, at some level, the operational issues are paramount. The marketing, the advertising, and that's the language we use. That's why they're with you. That's why we're sitting around the table. But find out who they are. I can't speak to your identity unless I know what's important to you.
Yeah.
Find out what divides us. Why are you, that frustration that you sometimes feel, I can't convert, this woman's not listening to me. You just don't listen. We have these little cliches that we use. And that is a good sign, because what is that obstacle? What is that barrier? Why is this barrier there? Why can't you accept my rates? Why don't you want to accept my advice? And the frustration kicks in because everyone else does it. That's what conventional wisdom says. That's what my experience has taught me. Those two people in your example, what creates that division? And it's locked into their identities. There's a threat there. There's a defensiveness there. And the minute you've got that, you start speaking to that, still using your operational language, but you bring comfort. What is it? Is it that they're worried of failure, for example? We find in South Africa, because of our history, and an absolute ton of research shows us that there's face-saving concerns, for example. You may agree with me, but you're worried about failure. You may agree with me, but the way that I convey it to you is offensive. And people would rather harm themselves. How's this for a depressing bit of statistic? People would rather harm themselves and their interest if they regard the process or the manner in which they're being spoken to. You may, and again, statistics show a range of examples and studies where you may agree with my advice, but choose not to accept it because you don't let white males speak to you that way.
Sure.
And that's directly, it comes from your identity, your values. It may be wrong, who's to decide, but have I persuaded you?
And you haven't connected at all, yeah.
I've got all the facts, or seemingly objective facts, and objectively, you may be wrong in rejecting my advice, but that's not what this game is all about. That's old school conflict management, where I preach to you from a position of being right, and that's what's quite ineffective.
Right.
It's about persuasion. It's about showing you a way to get to your best interest, and those two people in your examples would need in an important sense, they're talking past each other.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, totally.
And the danger is, because they don't have that specific conflict competency, it's going to get worse. I think you'll find it in your own career, where this is the 6th meeting that we're having, and you're just not hearing what I'm saying. I've gone away, I've done the research, my position is so right, yours is so wrong. Somewhere along the line, we are going to start giving up on each other. And
I think all too quickly there's compromise. So there's compromise, and then neither party is happy.
Exactly. Now, I'll just give her half of it. We meet you in the middle, and we're both upset. And we didn't manage this conflict. We didn't fix it. It's going to blow up somewhere where we have to go with a new agency. I don't like Gillian. It's uncomfortable. You hear it in the example that you mentioned. That Sunday evening feeling of resentment. I don't really want to meet with you on Monday. And that is a disaster waiting to happen. And that comes from compromise and a lack of conflict competence, where you're just difficult, and I'm trying to convince you. It's a form of conflict avoidance. It's a form of compromise that we become, and it's a terrible thing to say, but we become co-authors of our own misery. And while we should, if we knew how to, that situation, we'd always have difficult people. We'd always have conflict situations, but we should value them, and we should get better results from them. Our conflict outcomes should be far more constructive, more to everyone's benefit.
I also find that a lot of the conflict takes place at a junior or middle level, where those people don't feel that they have the power to resolve the conflict, and that the leadership has just got their head in the sand, and the leaders need to address it, or allow the people at a more middle level to feel that they have the right to tackle that conflict. So often those are the people that are stuck in this awful kind of repetitive cycle of horribleness, that from my perspective and the work I do is not effective business-wise. It's not efficient, it's not effective, it doesn't produce the results. So it's an imperative that it gets sorted out. But often they're just left in this kind of toxic sludge because the leaders are unwilling to actually step in, because they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to, and maybe it's because they just don't know how to.
In that example is obviously, it should go into the account of senior management. I see it often and on retainer clients and regular clients. We try and break down that culture of senior management sits in a boardroom. They have a wonderful, productive, really high-level, intelligent meeting. Things get put into place. Let's become conflict competent. But how it dribbles down to middle management and how that gets maintained is often, the intent is there. I walk into boardrooms and I convince people, but that's really only half the job. The people in that boardroom, they may be conflict competent. They may start working on it. But the guy in middle management, the woman in HR, they need that skill, and that is why, and that's a leadership issue ultimately.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you your book title, your first book, I think, your Dangerous Magic. I read a review on it that just said it was brilliant, and that it talks about the difficult, dangerous, magical process of resolution. So I wanted to ask you, why is it magical, and why is the magic dangerous?
It comes from a quotation from one of the American gurus, Kenneth Cloak. who tells us about moving from hate to understanding, from chaos to peace, from disagreement to positive agreement, is a type of magic, but it's a dangerous magic, because we need to understand each other. We need to be vulnerable. We need to open ourselves up to failure. And it's a different type of conflict. It's I deal with it every day. It is dangerous because we need to. It feels so dangerous. It feels so comforting to sue each other, to ignore each other, to compromise. Those are the comfortable little training wheels we used to. We don't want to fail. So, all right, let's just settle. Let's get the deal signed. It's not a great deal, but get the damn thing signed so no one criticizes me. And to become effective at conflict is a dangerous step into the dark. You need to take that step to see how much light there is in the room.
And as you say, you've got to be comfortable with vulnerability, right?
Yeah, it sounds like I can see the arms crossed in many a boardroom when I say that. We're about winning, and we don't. In an economy like this, we're not going to increase our vulnerability. Forget it. But that's not the type of vulnerability. I mean, I wouldn't leave a successful legal practice and go into something that's not effective, that is mumbo jumbo or meme quality stuff. Conflict management, when understood correctly and when done correctly, is a terribly hard skill. But once you do it correctly, if you're a corporate leader and you're really interested in looking after not again, our original point, not being a nice person, but being an effective person, and this is the way to do it. And that is where that vulnerability comes in. You're going to, in a sense, the business leaders. I had a big workshop the other day, and I asked senior management, and they were very happy with where things are going. And I said, all right, how do you feel? We were talking about vulnerability and their initial resentment and fear of making these changes. And the one senior manager said, this feels like we are pioneers. And I think that was quite correct. You need to take that first step into what often feels like a bit of darkness. The studies are there. Europe especially are starting to lead the field. If you're a senior manager now in Europe, conflict would be the heart of. We'd train you in HR and public speaking and all of those traditional things, but your real training is rooted in conflict. And the magic part comes from understanding that it's not just conflict resolution, which is sometimes not necessary or possible, or conflict management, where you've got that cyclical type of thing, but conflict transformation, where you being a toxic employee, for example, or an inefficient. The other wonderful example of you're brilliant at your job, but no one can work with you. Where we bring the tools and we transform that. We don't threaten you into submission, which is a problem waiting to happen. We don't fire you, which is also half a solution, but we transform that situation where you want to, not because you're told to, you want to be different. Your conduct is different. Your approach is different. Your results, your relationships with other people are more constructive. And that's where that dangerous magic comes in, where you become an alchemist, where it's not just the old tools of hire and fire and threatening or accepting. In South Africa, we accept tons of stuff we shouldn't be accepting. Because we need to be polite, because we simply don't know what the alternatives is. I don't know how to deal with this terrible conduct of yours. I don't want to lose you, so I'm not going to fire you. So in my mind, the only alternative is to accept your conduct. And that of course causes its own problems.
I do some coaching as well, and in these kind of alignments, interventions I do, the one thing that comes out a lot is I didn't realize that's how I made people feel.
Yeah.
Kind of an unconscious, I'm doing my job and I'm doing it the way I know how to do it. And I didn't realize that other people felt that way. I hear that a lot. It's kind of an unconsciousness of their own behavior and how it shows up in the world.
I think that's in my experience, and probably yours as well. It's often legitimate. The people don't know.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's an excuse, you know. Oh, I didn't know that behavior was rude. Sometimes it's just an excuse for poor behavior, but often, especially in South Africa, we find that there's a cultural difference where white males, for example, may think that walking into a room, being authoritative, laying down a list of all things is effective, and it may very well be. Some people with different cultural experiences and expectations may regard that as being rude, as being very much unproductive, and neither of those two are wrong. And you don't need compromise to get to a new solution, but it does require that understanding of identities involved there, why it creates conflict, and how to avoid it. Not in an avoiding way, in a negative way, but to transform it. And we're back to that magic part of it, where these realities we keep on, you know, we've made, especially with the whole range of BEE arguments, we've made this terrible mistake, and it's not just us. I mean, ask the US with recent developments there. We've made this terrible mistake of thinking that we have black, white, brown, green, and the way to resolve that is to make everyone beige. And that is simply not good conflict management. You're creating new conflicts, ironically. You've had 10, now you've got 15 because of your insistence on everyone must be beige, this cookie cutter approach to
force fitting.
Well, especially in a commercial environment, in a corporate environment, you should value, you should learn, and that's back to being conflict competent, where that diversity, those differences of opinion, that example that you mentioned of, I didn't know this is how people felt around me, you don't want to avoid that, you don't want to prevent that, you want to use that, to put it bluntly, to everyone's best, in everyone's best interest. And we don't know how. So we start tinkering with it, we start punishing it, we start pretending that it doesn't happen, we start telling ourselves that it's okay and it's not, and that creates these spirals of conflict. And we part of that is why we have the mess we have in the political landscape as well, an absolute inability to understand what's going on and then dealing with that.
I had years ago, someone gave me a useful piece of advice, and it was actually in terms of selling creative work in, for example, and then having pushback, or, you know, it being rejected, or, you know, and how do you move forward from that? And she gave the example of friction with a tire and the road, and she said, you know, the tire doesn't move forward without the friction on the road. And you've got to sort of reframe it as something that is positive and can you move you forward, as opposed to something that is negative and is going to move you, you know, stop you dead in your tracks, or move you backwards. And I've always found that a really helpful sort of reframing, as you say, of conflict doesn't have to be always a negative thing.
What is it that what would a world, what would a business without conflict look like?
Well, I don't think, there isn't one. So, but I just hear so often, like, oh, you know, I grew up with a lot of conflict in my family, so I hate dealing with conflict. And I mean, you can't, like, it's literally it's part of everybody's life from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep. But just last question, Andre, I wanted to ask you about your other book, your Hamlet's Mirror, where you look at conflict and AI, and how you think it's going to affect our professional and personal conflicts. what is your view on that? What does the title mean? What does Hamlet's mirror refer to?
Hamlet's mirror is a quote from Hamlet, where Hamlet tells his mother, "Sit down. I'm going to hold up this mirror, and you won't leave before we've had a look in this mirror." And the book is about what do we see when we look in the mirror. The book is about it is taking the. It sounds counterintuitive, but let's look at artificial intelligence as a human problem and not as a machine problem, not a technological problem. And the whole book is about looking in the mirror. What do we see? And we find disturbingly and reassuringly that we're the problem. AI is going to change the way we work. It is how we interact with each other, how our children go to school, the education levels, the way they are educated. We are going to have trials judged by machines. All of those. How are we going to deal with that? How does it change conflict management? How can we bulletproof ourselves as either on a professional level, a political level, or a highly personal level in what is absolutely inevitably going to come. It's a very positive book. It's not your normal Terminator doom and gloom. The computers are coming for us. I like to think that I show convincingly how it's okay. It's going to be okay, but we can prepare, and we need to prepare in certain ways to be ready for it.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting. I mean, I've been lecturing at UCT, and one of my students definitely submitted a ChatGPT answer, and I know that because he'd forgotten to take out one of the prompts. So, yeah. But I mentioned it to my young son in the car, and he said, "Well, frankly, Mum, if they're not using ChatGPT as a starting point, then they're not very bright." And I thought, oh, okay, fair enough. I mean,
didn't we have the same arguments on a much smaller level with calculators?
Oh, probably. We should have been doing it.
The desk calculator.
Yeah. But thank you, Andre. It's been so interesting. I feel like I could talk to you for the rest of the week, but so insightful. And I need to read your books as a starting point. But I think that also your blogs and things, and I'll post some articles to link to this. But it's been very insightful. I kind of feel like the world needs lots more of you. But lots more Andres to go and wave their magic wand and create that dangerous magic.
Thank you, Gillian.
Lovely to chat. Bye.
Bye-bye.